Imagine living in a home where locking your door is a crime punishable by whipping. For the enslaved on southern plantations, privacy was legally forbidden. Overseers used this open-door policy to barge in at midnight, turning intimate family moments into nightmares of violation and terror. But history hides a dark secret. On stormy nights, cruel men would kick open these unlocked doors expecting submission, and simply vanish from the face of the earth. The next morning, only a lantern would be found in the mud. What exactly was waiting for them in the dark? If a modern architect were to unroll the yellowed, crumbling blueprints of a typical southern cotton plantation from the year 1850, their trained eye would immediately be drawn to a singular, chilling omission that appears on every drafted elevation of the slave quarters. In the long, perfectly straight rows of rough-hewn wooden cabins that housed hundreds of human beings, the schematics reveal a total absence of locking mechanisms, latches, or simple hooks on the doors and windows, a design choice that transformed the concept of personal privacy into a forbidden and unreachable luxury. This missing hardware was not the result of a frugal plantation owner trying to save a few pennies on iron, nor was it an oversight by a builder rushing to complete the construction before the harvest season began in earnest. Instead, the open door was the physical manifestation of a carefully calculated psychological strategy, a weapon of architecture designed to instill a permanent sense of total vulnerability and perpetual surveillance in the minds of the enslaved population. The layout of these quarters was engineered to strip away the most basic human right to solitude, ensuring that even in the deepest hours of the night, the individual remained property rather than a person, subject to the whims of those who owned the deed to their bodies. By denying the simple mechanical ability to secure a threshold, the plantation system effectively declared that an enslaved person possessed no space that was truly their own, erasing the boundary between the public labor of the fields and the private intimacy of the family unit. The owners of these vast estates codified this lack of privacy into rigid laws, strictly forbidding slaves from creating makeshift locks or wedging heavy objects against the door frame to prevent entry from the outside. The prevailing logic among the ruling class was rooted in a deep-seated paranoia, asserting that a locked door was the first and most dangerous step toward a conspiracy, a planned insurrection, or the concealment of stolen goods. In the twisted moral universe of the antebellum South, the desire for privacy was interpreted as evidence of guilt, a sign that the occupants were plotting against the order of things, necessitating a system where the interior of a home was as transparent and accessible as the cotton rows they tended by day. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the crushing, back-breaking labor in the fields finally came to a halt, the men and women trudged back to these wooden shacks, carrying with them the exhaustion of the day and the heavy knowledge of their exposure. They returned to their dwellings knowing that the thin, warping planks of the door offered only a visual barrier against the elements, serving to keep out the wind and the rain but offering absolutely no protection against the human predators who patrolled the grounds. The door was a facade, a flimsy piece of theater that separated the dark interior from the moonlit exterior only in the most superficial sense, providing an illusion of domesticity that vanished the moment a hand pushed against the wood. The psychological toll of this architectural violence was immense, creating an atmosphere where the nervous system could never fully disengage from the survival mode of the day, even when the body was at rest. To live without a lock was to live in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the inevitable intrusion that could come in the form of a drunken overseer, a suspicious master, or a patrol looking for a scapegoat. The sanctity of the home, a universal concept revered by civilization, was systematically violated here, turning the cabin into a cage where the occupants were on display for anyone with white skin and a lantern to inspect at their leisure. The terror lay not just in what actually happened, but in the potential for what could happen at any second. This reality meant that any intimate moment, any whispered conversation between a husband and wife, or any silent prayer offered in the dark was performed under the crushing weight of potential interruption and punishment. The thin wooden barrier created a false sense of security that was shattered every time the heavy boots of the night patrol crunched on the gravel outside, pausing at the threshold to listen for signs of dissent. The enslaved families learned to live in a state of hypervigilance, their ears tuned to the specific rhythms of the plantation at night, knowing that their safety relied not on the strength of their walls, but on the whim of the man walking the beat with a whip coiled at his hip, ready to strike at shadows. Thus, the slave quarter was never truly a home in the traditional sense. It was merely a holding pen where the livestock of the plantation were stored between shifts, accessible to the management at all times without the need for keys or permission. The absence of the lock was the ultimate symbol of the power dynamic, a daily, tangible reminder that the master's authority did not end when the sun went down, but extended into the very dreams of the people he owned. In the year 1850, the greatest luxury on the cotton fields was not silk or sugar, but the simple, profound ability to turn a key and shut out the world, a right that was systematically stolen to break the spirit of a people. The central figure in this architecture of intimidation was the overseer, a man whose authority within the boundaries of the estate was absolute, functioning as judge, jury, and executioner over the bodies and souls of the labor force. While the plantation owner often remained a distant, patriarchal figure residing in the big house, the overseer was the gritty, tactile reality of enslavement, the immediate hand that enforced the will of the master with a brutality that was often personal and capricious. His power was not merely administrative, it was physical and pervasive, extending far beyond the daylight hours of agricultural production into the sacred time of rest, turning the slave quarters into a panopticon where no action went unobserved. He was the living embodiment of the surveillance state, a man whose job description required him to view every closed eye as a potential threat and every moment of silence as a breeding ground for insurrection, justifying his intrusion into the most private spheres of life as a necessary precaution for the safety of the institution. These nocturnal inspections were officially categorized in the plantation ledgers as security patrols, a bureaucratic euphemism designed to mask a campaign of systematic psychological warfare and terror. The stated purpose was to ensure that the workforce was present and resting for the next day's labor, but in practice, these rounds were a theatrical performance of dominance designed to remind the enslaved that their bodies did not belong to them, even in sleep. The overseer did not walk the rows of cabins with the protective demeanor of a guardian. He moved with the predatory grace of a hunter stalking game, his presence announcing that the boundary between the workday and the night's respite was an illusion. The patrol was a weaponized routine, a method of keeping the population in a state of chronic anxiety where the expectation of violence was as damaging as the violence itself, eroding the spirit through the constant friction of fear. Armed with a heavy tin lantern that cast long, dancing shadows against the rough timber walls and a braided leather whip that was never far from his grip, the overseer would begin his slow, deliberate march down the unpaved lane of the quarters. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic step that was instantly recognizable to the inhabitants, a sound that penetrated the thin walls and signaled the approach of danger long before he reached the door. He would often pause outside a cabin, extinguishing his light or shading it with his coat, pressing his ear against the gaps in the wood to listen to the breathing, the snoring, or the hushed whispers of the families inside. This act of voyeurism was a violation that preceded the physical entry, a theft of the private conversations and intimate moments that the enslaved attempted to steal back from their masters, turning the very walls of their homes into treacherous membranes that leaked their secrets to the enemy outside. The selection of a target for the night was rarely based on actual evidence of wrongdoing or suspicion of a specific crime, but was instead dictated by the overseer's foul mood, his boredom, or a sadistic desire to assert control. He might choose a cabin because he heard a child crying, or because the occupants had been too slow in the fields that day, or simply because the door was the first one he reached. There was no due process, no requirement for probable cause, and no defense against his intrusion. The whim of the overseer was the only law that mattered in the darkness. This randomness was a crucial element of the terror, as it meant that no one was ever safe. Being a compliant worker or a quiet resident offered no immunity from the midnight raid, ensuring that the entire community lived on a knife edge of apprehension, waiting for the boot to drop. When the moment of entry arrived, it was never a polite knock or a request for admission, but a violent, explosive event designed to maximize shock and disorientation. The overseer would kick the door open with the full force of his heel, the wood slamming against the interior wall with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. In the same instant, he would raise his lantern high, flooding the small, cramped space with a blinding yellow light that seared the eyes of the sleepers, tearing them from their dreams and plunging them into a waking nightmare. The sudden transition from darkness and silence to dazzling light and shouting was a calculated tactic to induce panic, rendering the occupants confused, vulnerable, and unable to hide anything before the inspection began. Men and women would scramble from their pallets, shielding their eyes and clutching their rags, forced to stand at attention while the intruder loomed over them, a giant silhouette framed by the doorway. The search that followed was a humiliating degradation of the meager domestic sphere that the slaves had managed to carve out for themselves. The overseer would tear through the room with a destructive energy, kicking over the simple wooden stools, overturning the corn shuck mattresses, and scattering the few personal possessions the family owned across the dirt floor. He was ostensibly looking for contraband, a broad and fluid category that could include anything from a sharpened stick to a piece of ribbon, but his primary targets were often the basic necessities of survival. He would root through the cooking pots and the hidden hollows beneath the floorboards, searching for a heel of cornbread or a piece of salted pork that a slave might have saved from their rations or acquired through illicit trading. To find such extra food was to find evidence of theft, for in the logic of the plantation, the slave's appetite was regulated by the master, and to eat more than was allotted was a crime against the economy of the estate. Even more dangerous than the discovery of food was the discovery of knowledge, which the overseer hunted with a fanatical zeal bordering on religious persecution. A tattered Bible, a scrap of newspaper, or a primer on the alphabet were considered weapons of mass destruction in the hands of the enslaved, proof of a rebellious intellect that had to be crushed immediately. If such an item was found during the raid, the consequences were severe and immediate, often involving a public whipping the next morning to serve as a warning to the rest of the quarter. The search for these items transformed the cabin from a shelter into a potential trap, where the very tools of spiritual or intellectual liberation became liabilities that could lead to torture. The overseer's eyes would scan every crevice, looking for the telltale shape of a book, knowing that keeping the workforce illiterate was as vital to the system as the chains and the high fences. This practice of nightly terror stripped the enslaved people of the most fundamental biological requirement for health and sanity, the right to a safe and uninterrupted sleep. The human body requires a sense of security to enter the deep stages of restorative rest, but on the plantation, this security was scientifically dismantled by the regime of the overseer. Even on nights when the door did not open, the anticipation of the intrusion kept the nervous system in a state of hyperarousal, a constant, low-level fight-or-flight response that prevented true relaxation. The slaves slept with one ear open, their bodies tense and ready to spring up, their dreams haunted by the specter of the lantern and the whip. This chronic sleep deprivation was not an accidental side effect, it was a tool of control that kept the workforce exhausted, docile, and mentally foggy, making it harder for them to organize, think clearly, or plan an escape. The psychological scars left by this environment were deep and permanent, creating a population that was conditioned to react with visceral terror to the sounds of the night. The creak of a floorboard, the snap of a twig outside, or the heavy thud of a boot on packed earth would trigger an immediate physiological response, a racing heart, cold sweat, and a paralysis of the limbs. This was a trauma that rewired the brain, associating the sanctuary of the home with the danger of the invasion, destroying the concept of a safe haven. The overseer knew this, he knew that the fear he planted at night would bear fruit in the day, manifesting as a submissive and broken workforce that was too tired and too terrified to look him in the eye. The patrol was the hammer that shattered the private self, leaving only the public servant who belonged to the master, a hollowed-out vessel filled with the echoes of the midnight raid. Ultimately, the power of the overseer lay not just in the physical pain he could inflict with his whip, but in his ability to command the space and time of the people under his charge. By invading their homes, he demonstrated that there was no corner of the earth where they were free from his gaze, no moment of the day when they were not property. The open door, the lantern, and the boot were the symbols of a total institution that sought to colonize the mind as thoroughly as it exploited the body. In the darkness of the slave quarter, the overseer was the monster under the bed made flesh, a terror that did not vanish with the morning light but simply changed its form, ensuring that the nightmare of captivity was a continuous, unbroken loop of surveillance and violation. The most monstrous and devastating aspect of this surveillance system was found not in the physical labor of the fields, but in the systematic annihilation of the family bond and the erotic dignity of the enslaved people, who struggled desperately to maintain a semblance of humanity within an institution designed to reduce them to livestock. For the husbands and wives who had pledged their troth to one another, often in secret ceremonies hidden from the master's eyes or by jumping the broom in a quiet rebellion of hope, the slave cabin was supposed to be a sanctuary where they could shed the identity of the chattel and return to being men and women. However, the architecture of the plantation, with its doorless frames and unlatched entryways, transformed their marital bed into a stage for public consumption, stripping away the privacy that is the essential soil in which intimacy and trust must grow. Lying side by side in the suffocating darkness of a Georgia summer or the biting cold of a Virginia winter, a couple could never truly relax into one another's arms, for they were haunted by the terrifying knowledge that the night did not belong to them, and that their union existed only by the fragile, temporary permission of the white men who owned the land. The psychological torture of this arrangement lay in the unpredictability of the violation, as the absence of a lock meant that the boundary between the brutal authority of the overseer and the tender vulnerability of the bedroom was non-existent. At any moment, without the courtesy of a knock or the warning of a shout, the rough wooden door could be flung open, admitting a figure who held the power of life and death over every soul in the room. This intruder, often reeking of stale whiskey and aggressive entitlement, did not need a reason to enter. His presence alone was an assertion of his dominance, a reminder that the bodies beneath the threadbare quilts were his to inspect, to command, or to use as he saw fit. For the couple lying in the dark, the sound of heavy boots crunching on the gravel outside was a signal that froze the blood, stopping intimate whispers in their throats and replacing the warmth of affection with the icy, paralyzing grip of terror. When the overseer stepped across the threshold, the dynamic in the room shifted instantly from a domestic scene to a scene of absolute subjugation, where the husband was stripped of his primary biological imperative to protect his mate. He was forced to lie rigid and motionless, feigning sleep or staring blindly into the shadows, while another man stood over his wife, casting a leering gaze that was in itself a form of assault. The overseer might bark orders, demand to see their faces, or engage in acts of sexual harassment that ranged from verbal degradation to physical fondling, all while the husband was compelled to witness the humiliation in a silence that screamed of impotence. This was not merely a byproduct of the system. It was a deliberate technique of emasculation, designed to break the spirit of the male slave by demonstrating that he possessed no power to shield the woman he loved from the whims of the master class. The agony of the husband in these moments was a complex and suffocating trauma, a calculated bind that forced him to choose between his instinctual honor and the physical survival of his entire family. He knew with a crystal clarity that any attempt to rise, to strike out, or even to speak a word of protest would result in consequences far worse than the immediate indignity of the intrusion. To challenge the overseer was to sign a death warrant, often leading to a public lynching that would leave his wife a widow, or, perhaps more cruelly, to an immediate sale that would shatter the family forever. The threat of separation was the whip that kept him pinned to the mattress, the knowledge that if he fought back, his wife would be sold down the river to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, and his children would be scattered to the winds, never to be seen again. Thus, his passivity was an act of supreme sacrifice, a swallowing of bile and rage to ensure that they would wake up together the next morning, even if that morning brought with it a crushing sense of shame. For the woman, the horror was a dual assault on her body and her mind, as she lay exposed and vulnerable, acutely aware that her husband's silence was not a lack of love, but a desperate bid for their mutual preservation. She became the focal point of the overseer's power play, her body treated not as the temple of her husband's affection, but as public property available for the visual or physical consumption of the administration. The intrusion turned her sexuality into a weapon used against her partner, forcing her to endure the gaze or the touch of the oppressor while praying that her husband would not react and bring down the wrath of the plantation upon them. This dynamic eroded the foundation of their relationship, introducing a poisonous element of guilt and helplessness into their intimacy, as every touch thereafter was shadowed by the memory of the night when they were forced to be complicit in their own degradation. The objective of this systemic invasion was to reduce the enslaved population to the status of breeding stock, eradicating the concept of the nuclear family which might serve as a competing locus of loyalty against the master. By turning the slave cabin into a thoroughfare, the plantation owners sought to instill the idea that the bodies of the enslaved existed solely for labor and reproduction, devoid of the complex emotional needs that define humanity. The woman was viewed as a producer of capital, both in the cotton she picked and the children she bore, and the man was viewed as a stud, stripped of the fatherly and husbandly authority that defines masculinity in free societies. The open door was a constant reminder that their marriage was a fiction tolerated by the owner, a temporary arrangement that could be dissolved or violated whenever the economic or carnal interests of the white staff dictated. Over time, this relentless lack of privacy corroded the internal life of the slave community, creating a unique form of psychological scarring that lingered long after the overseer had left the cabin. The shame of what transpired in the night often created a wall of silence between couples, a shared trauma that was too painful to articulate in the light of day. How could a man look his wife in the eye after watching her be fondled by the overseer and doing nothing? How could a wife respect a husband who lay still while another man violated their sanctuary? These were the insidious questions that the system planted in their minds, designed to rot the bonds of affection and replace them with a resentment that turned the oppressed against one another. It was a divide-and-conquer strategy played out in the most intimate sphere of human existence, ensuring that the enslaved remained emotionally isolated even when they were sleeping in the same bed. Yet, amidst this landscape of devastation, the persistence of marriage and family among the enslaved stands as a testament to a resilience that the overseer's whip could not fully extinguish. Despite the open doors, the lack of locks, and the constant threat of violence, men and women continued to fall in love, to jump the broom, and to cling to one another in the dark. They developed silent languages of comfort, subtle gestures of reassurance, and a profound, unspoken understanding that their survival was the ultimate act of resistance. The very fact that they continue to form bonds in a world designed to atomize them suggests that the human need for connection is stronger than the most brutal architectural and social engineering. The overseer could invade their room, he could strip them of their dignity for a night, but he could not entirely destroy the sacred, defiant choice to love in the face of annihilation. This chapter of history reveals that the true horror of slavery was not just the theft of labor, but the attempted theft of the soul through the destruction of the private self. The cabin without a lock was a laboratory of human cruelty, a space where the plantation administration experimented with the limits of psychological endurance. By turning the bedroom into a public space, they sought to breed a compliant, broken people who had no secrets and no sanctuaries. That they failed to completely destroy the black family is a miracle of history, but the scars of those sleepless nights, spent waiting for the door to open, were carved deep into the psyche of a generation, a legacy of trauma born from the terrifying reality that in the eyes of the law, a slave had Northwest right to close the door on the world. However, this relentless and suffocating invasion of personal space produced a profound and unintended counter-effect that the plantation owners, in their arrogance, had failed to anticipate and which rarely appeared in their meticulous agricultural ledgers. By stripping away the physical barriers between households and removing the locks that separated one family from another, the administration inadvertently destroyed the isolation that usually keeps a subjugated population fragmented and weak. The architecture of exposure, designed to facilitate control, forced the enslaved community to evolve into a singular, hyperconnected biological organism where the nervous system of one individual was inextricably linked to the nervous system of the neighbor sleeping 5 feet away. The absence of privacy meant that the survival of the individual became entirely dependent on the vigilance of the group, creating a network of collective awareness that was far more sophisticated and impenetrable than the crude surveillance tactics employed by the men with the whips. Life without doors and locks necessitated the development of an auditory acuity that bordered on the supernatural, as the ears of the enslaved became attuned to the subtle vibrations of the night with the precision of prey animals living in predator-filled territory. The slave quarter, seemingly silent and dormant to the casual observer, was in reality a landscape of intense sensory activity where every sound was catalogued, analyzed, and interpreted by hundreds of listening minds simultaneously. The people learned to map the acoustic signature of the plantation, distinguishing the harmless rustle of the wind in the pecan trees from the ominous, rhythmic crunch of leather boots on the packed earth. They could identify the specific gait of a particular overseer from 100 yards away, knowing by the weight of the step or the jingle of keys whether the approaching figure was the drunken brute who sought violence or the weary patroller who would likely pass by without incident. This heightened sensory environment gave birth to an invisible and rapid system of communication that functioned under the very noses of the oppressors, a grapevine of intelligence that moved faster than any man could walk. Because the walls were thin and the doors were unlatched, a signal initiated at one end of the row could travel the entire length of the quarters in a matter of seconds without a single word being spoken aloud. The warning system relied on a complex vocabulary of innocuous noises, a sharp, sudden cough that cut through the silence, a rhythmic tapping on a wooden floorboard that vibrated through the foundation, or a sudden change in the cadence of a lullaby hummed by a mother in the dark. These were not random sounds, but coded transmissions that alerted the community to the location and trajectory of the threat, allowing those further down the line to hide forbidden items, feign deep sleep, or extinguish a candle long before the overseer arrived at their threshold. The transparency of their living conditions, intended to leave them naked before the master's gaze, paradoxically forged a bond of circular responsibility that is rare in free societies where privacy allows for secrets and separation. In the slave quarters, privacy was an impossible dream, so it was replaced by a radical form of communal intimacy where every joy, every tragedy, and every transgression was known to all. If a man stole an extra piece of pork to feed his starving child, the neighbors knew. If a woman was planning to run toward the North Star, the community sensed her preparation. Yet, this total lack of internal privacy was matched by an absolute, ironclad wall of silence directed outward toward the white authority. The secrets of the quarter circulated freely among the enslaved, binding them together in a conspiracy of survival, but these secrets hit a dead end the moment they reached the ears of anyone with power, creating a parallel reality that the masters could see but never truly understand. The violence that was calculated to atomize the population and turn them against one another through fear instead acted as a potent binding agent, fusing the community together with the mortar of shared hatred and collective trauma. Every time an overseer barged into a cabin to humiliate a family, the shockwave of that violation was felt by every other family in the row, reinforcing the understanding that an injury to one was a threat to all. The shared experience of vulnerability stripped away the petty jealousies and interpersonal conflicts that might have divided them, leaving behind a hardened, unified front that viewed the oppressor as a common enemy who must be outmaneuvered. The forced intimacy meant that they breathed the same air, suffered the same indignities, and ultimately, harbored the same dark fantasies of retribution, creating a psychological reservoir of resistance that grew deeper with every uninvited footstep on the porch. This collective intelligence transformed the psychological landscape of the plantation, shifting the balance of power in ways that the overseer, blinded by his own sense of superiority, could not perceive. He believed he was the hunter stalking through a passive herd, unaware that he was moving through a field of hundreds of hostile eyes that tracked his every movement from the darkness. The open doorways that allowed him to enter it will also allowed the community to monitor him, to learn his habits, his weaknesses, and his patterns of behavior with a forensic level of detail. They knew when he was drunk, they knew when he was tired, and they knew when he was distracted by his own personal demons. The architectural flaw of the unlocked door worked both ways. It removed the barrier for the victim, but it also removed the barrier for the observer, turning the surveillance state back upon itself and converting the quarters into a panopticon where the jailer was the one being watched. The knowledge that they were part of a unified, watchful whole gave the enslaved a profound psychological armor, a sense that even in their most vulnerable moments, they were not truly alone. When a husband lay freezing in his bed, listening to the overseer harass his neighbor, he was not merely a passive witness, he was a node in a living network, memorizing the details of the crime for a future accounting. This shared consciousness eroded the paralyzing effects of isolation, allowing the spirit of rebellion to fester and grow in the fertile soil of their communal suffering. They realized that the physical transparency of their homes made them vulnerable to immediate violence, but their mental opacity, the inability of the master to penetrate the web of their silent communication, made them dangerous in the long term. Ultimately, the unintended consequence of the no-locks policy was the creation of a waiting game, a simmering tension where the oppressed patiently studied the oppressor through the very gaps in the walls intended to enslave them. The overseer, confident in his unchecked access, began to grow careless, mistaking the silence of the quarters for submission rather than strategic observation. He did not realize that the open door was slowly transforming from a symbol of his power into a potential trap, a threshold that he might one day cross without realizing that the collective organism inside had decided that he would never cross it back. The lack of privacy had not broken the community, it had hardened it, stripping away the illusion of safety and replacing it with the cold, calculating clarity of people who have nothing left to lose but the chains that bind them. The culmination of this silent, grinding war of attrition invariably arrived under the cover of atmospheric chaos, on nights when the heavens opened up and the natural world seemed to conspire with the oppressed against the oppressor. It was during the violent thunderstorms that frequently battered the humid lowlands of the south, when the wind howled through the cypress trees and the thunder cracked with enough force to rattle the windowpanes of the big house, that the balance of power in the slave quarters shifted with a lethal suddenness. The cacophony of the storm provided the perfect acoustic camouflage for retribution, a sonic blanket that swallowed screams and the sounds of struggle, ensuring that what happened in the dark corners of the plantation would remain buried in the noise of the gale. On such nights, an overseer, often emboldened by the liquid courage of cheap whiskey and driven by a predatory urge that had gone unchecked for too long, would make the fatal error of believing that the laws of physics and fear still operated in his favor. He would step out into the rain, his lantern flickering in the gusts, convinced that his authority was waterproof, unaware that the weather had stripped him of his greatest protection, the ability to be heard. The archives of Southern county courthouses are filled with dry, perplexing notations regarding the sudden and unexplained disappearances of plantation managers during the mid-19th century, entries that speak of men vanishing into the ether without a trace. These incidents were often officially attributed to accidental drownings in swollen creeks or impulsive departures for the Western Territories, but the oral histories of the enslaved suggest a far darker and more deliberate reality. The scenario was grimly consistent: an overseer, perhaps harboring a grudge or seeking a specific victim for his nocturnal abuses, would approach a cabin that he knew to be unlocked, relying on the state-mandated vulnerability of the occupants to grant him easy access. He would kick open the door, expecting to find cowering submission, but instead, he would step across the threshold into a void where the rules of engagement had been rewritten by desperation. In that split second, the absence of a lock, which was designed to keep the slaves exposed, suddenly turned against the intruder, for just as there was nothing to keep him out, there was now nothing to protect him from the wrath that waited inside. In that fatal moment of entry, the overseer would find himself enveloped by a darkness that felt heavy and intentional, a suffocating blackness where the layout of the room was known intimately to the residents but was a treacherous maze to the outsider. The psychological shock of the ambush was often as paralyzing as the physical blow, as the predator suddenly realized that the prey had ceased to run and had turned to fight with the ferocity of cornered animals. The transparency of the walls, which had allowed him to spy on them for months, now worked in reverse. He was trapped in a wooden box with people who had spent every waking hour observing his movements, his reaction times, and his blind spots. The element of surprise was total, shattering the illusion of white supremacy that the overseer wore like armor, replacing it with the primal, terrifying realization that in the dark, rank and race offered no shield against kinetic energy and the physics of a swinging blow. The instruments of this justice were not the refined weapons of a duel or the firearms of a soldier, for slaves were strictly forbidden from possessing such items, but rather the heavy, brutal tools of their domestic servitude weaponized by rage. A cast-iron skillet, seasoned by years of cooking over an open fire and weighing enough to crush bone, became a lethal bludgeon when wielded by a woman whose arm strength was honed by lifting cotton bales. Heavy lengths of logging chain, normally used to haul timber or secure livestock, were repurposed in the dark as garrotes or flails, swinging with a momentum that could snap a neck or shatter a knee in a single, sickening arc. And when no tools were at hand, the retribution was delivered by the raw, unvarnished power of the human body itself, hands that were calloused from the plow and the hoe, fingers that could grip like steel vices, closing around a windpipe with the crushing force of hydraulic pressure. The violence of these encounters was brief, frantic, and absolute, devoid of the hesitation that comes from moral uncertainty, for the occupants knew that there could be no half measures once the struggle began. To injure an overseer was a death sentence, so the only option was to silence him permanently, turning the cabin into a temporary slaughterhouse where years of accumulated humiliation were released in a flurry of strikes. The physical disparity that usually protected the overseer, his whip and his pistol, was nullified by the close quarters of the shack, where a long lash was useless and a gun could be wrestled away in the swarm of bodies. It was a chaotic, intimate form of combat where the smell of rain mixing with the metallic scent of blood created a sensory imprint that would haunt the survivors forever, a grim reminder that their freedom for that one night was bought at the price of their humanity. Outside the cabin, amidst the roaring wind and the driving rain, the reaction of the surrounding community was a masterpiece of passive resistance and collective denial. The living organism of the slave quarter, which was so attuned to every sound, would undoubtedly hear the dull thud of a body hitting the floor or the muffled cry cut short by a hand over a mouth. Yet, in those critical seconds, the vaunted surveillance network of the enslaved went completely dark to the outside world. Neighbors who would normally signal a warning now lay in their beds with their eyes wide open, breathing in sync with the storm, willing the deed to be done. No head popped out of a door to investigate, no voice raised an alarm, and no witness stepped forward to intervene, creating a circle of complicity that was as impenetrable as a stone wall. Officially, the entire row was asleep, exhausted from the day's labor, their deafness to the murder serving as their contribution to the execution. This collective inaction was the ultimate betrayal of the overseer's expectations, for he had spent his career believing that he could use the slaves against one another, relying on informants and fear to maintain control. In his final moments, pinned to the dirt floor of a shack he had entered as a tyrant, he would realize that the transparency of the slave quarters was a lie he had told himself. The lack of privacy had not made the slaves loyal to him, it had only taught them how to coordinate their silence. He was dying alone in a crowded room, surrounded by hundreds of people who were technically his charges but who had silently voted to revoke his right to breathe. The open door, which he had used as a symbol of his power to violate their sanctuary, had become the mouth of a trap that had swallowed him whole, leaving the rest of the plantation to sleep the deep, innocent sleep of the just. The aftermath of such a confrontation required a nerves of steel disposal operation that had to be executed before the first gray light of dawn touched the fields. The body, now a heavy and incriminating liability, had to be removed from the cabin and transported through the mud and the rain without leaving a trail that could lead back to a specific family. This was where the physical strength of the men and the organizational skills of the women, honed by generations of managing scarce resources, were put to their grimmest test. They moved with the efficiency of undertakers, wrapping the corpse in the same sacks used for picking cotton, creating a shroud that was indistinguishable from the tools of their trade. The storm, which had provided the cover for the killing, now aided in the cleanup, washing away the blood from the threshold and obliterating the footprints in the yard, scrubbing the crime scene clean with a torrential indifference. By the time the plantation bell rang the next morning, signaling the start of another day of backbreaking labor, the cabin would be scrubbed, the skillet returned to the hearth, and the family would step out into the lineup with faces that betrayed nothing but the usual fatigue. The disappearance of the overseer would spark confusion, searches, and accusations, but the narrative had already been set in stone by the storm and the silence. He had wandered off, he had fallen into the river, or he had been taken by the devil himself. Any story was plausible in a world where death was a constant companion. The true story, written in the dark with iron and bone, would remain locked within the minds of those who lived there, a secret kept safe in a place that had no locks, proving that the strongest fortress is not built of wood and stone, but of the shared will to survive. The finale of these grim, nocturnal dramas was almost always shrouded in a thick, impenetrable veil of mystery that evoked a complex mixture of suppressed horror and quiet, vindictive satisfaction among the contemporaries of the time. When the sun finally rose over the plantation the morning after the storm, casting long, pale rays through the dissipating mist, the first sign that the order of the world had shifted was often a small, solitary object left abandoned in the mud. It might be the battered, wide-brimmed hat of the overseer, lying face down in a puddle near the edge of the slave quarters, or perhaps his heavy tin lantern, the glass shattered and the oil spilled, marking the last known location of a man who had effectively ceased to exist. These artifacts stood like silent tombstones in the churning mire of the plantation yard, physical proof of a presence that had evaporated into the humid morning air, leaving behind a vacuum that the plantation owner scrambled desperately to fill with logic and noise. The discovery of the missing men would trigger an immediate and frantic mobilization of the estate's resources, as the master, driven by a gnawing panic that he dared not voice, organized search parties to scour the surrounding landscape. Mounted on high-stepping horses and armed with rifles, the white men would fen out across the fields and into the dense, tangled woodlands that bordered the property, their shouts echoing uselessly against the trees. They brought with them packs of baying bloodhounds, expensive animals trained to track the scent of a human being through miles of difficult terrain, relying on the dogs to locate the fugitive or the corpse. The hounds would strain at their leashes, their noses buried in the wet earth, tracing the overseer's path from the big house to the slave quarters, but invariably, the trail would end abruptly in the center of the yard, as if the men had been plucked from the face of the earth by the hand of God himself. The search parties would then turn their attention to the treacherous geography of the South, dragging the muddy bottoms of the nearby creeks with grappling hooks and poking long poles into the sucking quicksand of the cypress swamps. The natural environment of the plantation country was filled with places where a man could disappear, deep sinkholes, alligator-infested bayous, and thickets of briar so dense they could swallow a body whole, and the searchers clung to the hope that this was a simple case of an accident. They told themselves that the overseer, perhaps drunk or disoriented by the storm, had wandered off the path and fallen into a ravine, a tragic but understandable end that did not threaten the social order. Yet, as the hours turned into days and no corpse bloated with gas rose to the surface of the river, a cold dread began to settle in the stomachs of the searchers, a realization that the landscape was not the culprit. The true explanation for the disappearance was far more gruesome and utilitarian, a secret knowledge that was shared only by the enslaved community and guarded with a life-or-death fidelity. The slaves knew, with the grim pragmatism born of their brutal existence, that leaving a body to be found was a mistake that would bring the wrath of the law down upon the entire quarter. To commit the perfect crime of retribution, the evidence had to be not just hidden, but completely annihilated, erased from the physical world so that no coroner could ever convene a jury. The solution to this forensic problem lay in the distant, muddy pens located on the far periphery of the plantation, where the semi-feral hogs were kept, animals that were as much a part of the waste management system as they were a food source. These were not the docile, pink domestic pigs of a children's story, but massive, bristled razorbacks with voracious appetites and jaws capable of crushing the femur of an ox. Kept hungry and accustomed to scavenging for their sustenance, the swine were the ultimate biological disposers, capable of consuming almost any organic matter placed before them with a terrifying speed and efficiency. In the dead of night, while the storm was still raging, the body of the overseer, stripped of metal buttons and buckles that might survive the digestion process, would be carried to the pen and cast into the churning mud. The animals, driven by instinct and hunger, would descend upon the intrusion, and within the space of a few hours, the physical form of the oppressor would be transmuted into nothing more than the livestock that he had once counted in his ledgers. The horror of this method lay in its absolute completeness. The pigs left nothing behind, no flesh, no organs, and most importantly, no bones that could be identified as human. Even the clothing, torn and bloody, would be consumed or trampled so deep into the slurry of mud and manure that it would decompose rapidly, becoming indistinguishable from the filth of the sty. This was the final indignity visited upon the men who had terrorized the cabins. He did not receive a Christian burial, nor even a shallow grave in the woods, but was literally processed through the bellies of the lowest animals on the farm. It was a symbolic and literal erasure, a way of saying that the man who had treated people like animals was ultimately consumed by them, his existence wiped away as if he had never been born. For the plantation owner, the failure to find a body presented a complex political and psychological dilemma that required a careful crafting of the official narrative. To admit the possibility that an overseer had been murdered by the slaves and his body destroyed was to admit that the system of control had failed catastrophically, a confession that could spark copycat rebellions across the state. The myth of white invincibility and black submission had to be maintained at all costs, so the master would often publicly conclude that the missing man was a thief and a coward. The official story entered into the county records would state that the overseer had absconded in the night, stealing a pouch of gold coins or a valuable horse, fleeing to the lawless territories of Texas or Mexico to escape his debts. This fabrication served the dual purpose of saving face for the planter and denying the slaves the satisfaction of an acknowledged victory. By painting the overseer as a criminal who abandoned his post, the master avoided the terrified speculation that would arise from an unsolved murder, allowing the plantation to return to its routine with a veneer of normalcy. Yet, this lie rang hollow to everyone involved. The slaves knew the truth because they had orchestrated it, and the master, deep in his private thoughts, knew that men do not leave behind their hats, their lanterns, and their personal effects when they are running away to start a new life. The silence that followed was a negotiated truce, a mutual agreement to pretend that the violence had not happened, even as the ghost of the missing man hung heavy over the fields. However, the legacy of the disappearance had a profound and lasting impact on the succession of men who came to fill the vacant post. When a new overseer was hired, he would inevitably hear the whispers and the rumors, the fragmented stories of his predecessor who walked into the dark and never walked out. As he took up his residence in the overseer's house and strapped on his belt, he would look down the long row of slave cabins with a gaze that was no longer filled with arrogance, but with a creeping, corrosive paranoia. The open doorways, which were designed to be windows into the lives of the slaves, now looked like gaping black mouths waiting to swallow him whole, portals to a dimension where his authority meant nothing. The new man would find himself hesitating before he stepped off his porch at night, his hand lingering on the grip of his pistol, his imagination populating the shadows with waiting threats. The psychological weapon of the open-door policy had backfired in the most spectacular fashion. Instead of making the slaves feel watched, it made the overseer feel exposed. He began to realize that in a world without locks, the danger flowed in both directions, and that by removing the barriers to the cabins, the plantation had also removed the barriers that kept the vengeance of the quarters contained. He knew that if he crossed the threshold with malice in his heart, he was entering a sovereign territory where the only law was survival, and where the judge and jury were waiting in the dark with a cast-iron verdict. Thus, the system of total control, engineered to strip the enslaved of their privacy and their dignity, ultimately created a zone of lethal danger for the controllers themselves. The open door became a symbol not of the master's omnipotence, but of his mortality, a reminder that every invasion of privacy carries with it a terrible risk. The overseers learned to walk softly past the cabins, to keep their eyes forward, and to respect the silence of the night, knowing that the sleeping community was watching them back. In the end, the transparency of the slave quarters did not break the spirit of the people. It hardened them into a collective force that could make a man vanish into the mist, leaving behind only a hat and a terrifying lesson about the limits of power.